I'm going to go ahead and start my portion of the master class. We're going to talk about drum brushes. And one of the things that all of my students already know is that I am really into interactive learning. So here's the thing. As we go through this, if I do something that you're a little bit unclear of, you're like, wait a minute, I'm unsure about what that's supposed to be. I didn't understand what he meant when he said that. Raise your hand, say, hey, wait a minute, I don't know what that is, because we want you to learn something out of this. We want to make sure that you get something out of this. You take something away, right? So if you would, you notice that there's some handouts that I put in there. It's got your little registration ticket on it. It's on your seat. We're going to start using those in just a moment, okay? We're going to start on where it says brush sounds. And you'll notice there's also a little QR code down there on the bottom. That QR code takes you to my YouTube channel where I have a series of different instructional videos. And you can also access my podcast that I had for several years called Drummer's Weekly Groovecast, which incidentally, Sonny's on. So we did a interview probably about 5 or 6 years ago, back when I lived in Atlanta, okay? So without any further delay, let's go ahead and talk about some drum brushes. Now, the reason I decided to use this topic is because not only do I feel like drum brushes are one of the, we'll say, less appreciated or maybe even less known about instruments, but one of the other things, it's one of the most expressive instruments that we have as a musician. And, you know, not to say, of course, you can do lots of great things with sticks, don't get me wrong. But with brushes, they have a completely and totally separate vocabulary from sticks. And let me demonstrate what I mean by that for a second, okay? Now, of course, you can play brushes like sticks, right? And believe me, there's been plenty of very famous and well-known drummers that have done that. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. For example, you can use brushes exactly as just basically a substitute for sticks. So if you just played a backbeat oriented groove, you could play something like this. Maybe even a little hi-hat, right? Now, again, there's nothing wrong with that, and you need to be able to do that. And as a matter of fact, if you want to throw a little bit of a historical name out there, there's a great L.A. drummer named Russell Kunkel, made his living doing that on some of those old James Taylor records, right? So if you go back and listen to those old records, you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. He basically was just using brushes as a substitute for sticks to give him a slightly different timbre and also probably just less percussive attack and just a little bit of a gentler, more tender kind of a sound, right, as opposed to a stick-based backbeat. Now, the second, what I call like dividing line, as far as like using brushes, is using brushes like brushes, is what I say. And essentially what that is this is where you start using the brushes using their own proprietary vocabulary. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play a few little things for you here on snare drum that uses proprietary brush vocabulary. And then what we'll do is we'll go through and break down what those sounds are, and then I'll show you some of those individual patterns. I've got a few things up here on the screen that I'm going to show you as part of our presentation, especially when we get to the brush patterns. So this would be what I would call playing brushes like brushes, okay? So, so that's a little bit of what I would call proprietary brush vocabulary. Now, let's kind of break that down now. Let's talk about what that proprietary brush vocabulary is. So we all pretty much know as drummers that the building blocks of drumming is roughly based around rudiments, right? And you know, there's the whole host of we call the 26 standard rudiments, then we have the 40, like the extended rudiments, then you have all these hybrid rudiments after that, right? Well, we kind of have some brush rudiments also, or at least some brush sounds, so to speak. Now, of course, you can end up playing these brushes using actual traditional rudiments, which I'm going to show you when we get closer to the end of this masterclass. So if you would, go ahead and pull up your sheet, which I will use the clicker here. There you go, and you can see the sheet called Brush Sounds, okay? And what I'm going to do is go through and explain these brush sounds, and we're going to put a name with some of the sounds, because that's one of the things also. You saw me play a whole bunch of different sounds over here on this snare drum, and they all have different names, right? In other words, just like, you know, patafla-fla is a name for a rudiment. So let me go ahead and put my old man glasses on really quickly so I can read. And I'm going to move this microphone over here. Okay, so this first sound that we're going to look at is called the sweep or the swish, okay? And it's pretty self-explanatory, right? In other words, basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the brush, the fan of the brush, and sweep or swish it around the drum head, okay? And you know what? Hang on. Let me back up 1 second before I do this, because I've got this whole tray table of stuff. I've already had people ask me about what is all that up there. Let me go ahead and explain this really quickly before I get into these actual brush sounds. I want to talk about all the different styles of brushes and different types of things that you need to be able to play these brush sounds. Then we'll double back to this really quickly, okay? So first, you've already seen me playing with these things. These are wire brushes. These days, there's every shade of gray of brush that you could possibly want, okay? And let me break it down really into 3 main categories. For wire brushes, you mainly have different gauges or thicknesses of the wire, okay? And that gives you different sounds. So for example, this is sort of the industry standard, okay? This is the Regal Tip 583R. And maybe you can see what I'm going to do here. When I do this, you can see there's quite a bit of flex on this brush. This is probably the thinnest wire brush that you can get, okay? Got lots of flex. Gives you a little less stick-like rebound, but it gives you really lush swishes and sweeps. The one you saw me play with just a moment ago, this is kind of in the middle. This is medium gauge wires, okay? This is also a Regal Tip brush. This is a signature brush by a guy named Jason Sutter. And you can see that the gauge of wire is a little bit thicker and a little more stiff. It's a great kind of go-between, right? And then you got this thing. This is the Jeff Hamilton signature brush. Now, this is got extremely heavy gauge wire. And Jeff likes these in particular. He's one of the master brush players of all time. He likes these for a couple of reasons. One, it gives you incredible response whenever you play on the drum. The second thing is this, is he can use just the very, very ends of these these brush wires and get a really thick, lush sounding sweep without having like press the wires into the actual drum head, okay? So I'm just going to let you hear what these sound like, because it's astounding the difference in sound between these, okay? So I'm just going to play some sweeps and a few taps, okay? This is the 583R. This is the standard Regal Tip brush. Medium gauge. And then the heaviest, these are the Hamilton brushes. Could you tell the difference on those? Yeah, it's pretty dramatic, really, isn't it? You've also got these guys. these are plastic brushes. Now, I'm not a fan of these at all, especially for doing what I was doing over here. Now, if you wanted to use your brushes like Russell Kunkel in particular, maybe do like, the backbeat-oriented type brush work, excellent choice for these, okay? And then for your country train beat in particular, which is I'm preaching to the choir here, right? These things, these are Regal Tip Blastics. These are about the best things I've ever used in particular if you wanted a good go-between between a wire brush and a stick, right? Doesn't give you quite the percussive attack as of a stick, but more percussive attack than a wire brush for sure, and about 10 times more durable. One thing that you'll notice also is if you're a rather aggressive train beat player and you're playing a wire brush, you got about a 50-50 chance you're going to lose every one of those strands somewhere in the middle of a backbeat. Because, and let me explain, because I mean, I'm a survivor. The one thing that that a lot of people didn't know, and this is including, I didn't know this either, is that brushes, wire brushes, the way that they're constructed, I thought for the longest time that what they were is they were these pieces of metal that were looped down into the handle. In other words, they were basically a bent piece of wire, right? In other words, and they were like held by something underneath, right? No, it's not. They're actually all individual wires that are crimped with a metal fastener. And so when one or two of those go, you can imagine what happens. It doesn't take long after one or two of those wires go. They lose a little bit of their integrity as far as like the way they're held together, and then they all go. It just completely and totally fly away. So that's why I really like these if I'm doing train beats. Wouldn't call them brushes, but these are excellent. And then you've got the famous multi-rods, right? Almost every drumstick manufacturer makes those. Again, not really brushes, okay, but it's a kind of a good substitute that goes in between sticks and wire brushes or sticks and any other type of brushes. They give you, again, a little more percussive attack, but not as much percussive attack as a drumstick, okay? Now, a couple of other things that you're going to need. Did you notice that on this drum set and on this snare drum, it's a coated drum head, okay? You need a coated drum head to be able to play brushes on because, first off, just a quick 30-second history lesson. The reason that coated drum heads even exist is, if you recall way back in the day, which was on a Wednesday, we used to play drums with skin heads, animal skin heads, like calf skin heads, right? Well, if you've ever seen a calf skin head, or if you've ever played on one, you'll notice if you feel like there's a little bit of a grain, and that will allow your brushes in particular to also grab onto something to get a sound, right? Well, when plastic drum heads were being invented, they had to replace calfskin heads. And so they had to come up with something that gave it a grain, and so they put a coating on these drum heads. And so that's why you need a coated head. It gives you a little bit of a grain for your brush to grab onto, okay? So you need a coated drum head. Now, that being said, I would stay away from any coated drum head that has any like raised dots on the top of it, or like some of them also have like some of them have like a raised ring on the outside, that type thing. That's just going to get your brushes caught. That's just that's a pothole in the road, right, or a speed bump in the road. So you want just a plain old a plain old coated head. Like for example, I'm using an Aquarian texture coated head. Wonderful. The other ones that I can think of would be, of course, like a Remo Ambassador. Right? Now, you can also use, Remo makes a drum head called a fiber skin, and that has a bit of a texture or grain to it too. But there's one fatal flaw on that drum head that they haven't been able to fix. And essentially what it is this, is after you play on a fiber skin head for a little while, with sticks in particular, what happens is that fiber, which is essentially just a blown-on paper type substance that's kind of blown onto the plastic mylar, the fiber has a tendency to delaminate after you play on it for a while. It kind of bubbles up. So you know what's going to happen. You're going to be in the middle of a gig. The fiber skin head's going to delaminate. It's going to bubble up a little bit. You're going to pick up your wire brushes. What's going to happen? The wire brush is going to go right through that. It's going to get stuck. Okay? And then essentially what happens after that is it just starts pulling up all of the fiber that's on there. So Fiber skin, Jeff Hamilton uses them, so I mean, there's something to be said for that, but he deals with that problem as well. They do delaminate over time. It causes a problem. So that's why I just like good old-fashioned coated head. Now, coated heads are not perfect. You need to carry some of this. This is like 220 grit sandpaper, okay? Even as good as coated heads are these days, you still have little imperfections in the spraying process. You have to take a little bit of sandpaper, just very lightly go over it. Okay, don't Bob Vila that thing, right? Don't bear down on it. I walked in, there was one time I was teaching, and I walked in on a student who had brought his snare drum in, and he had some like 80 grit sandpaper, and I mean, he was like putting some muscle into that thing, and I'm like, buddy, watch it, right? So just very, very light. All you want to do is just any little imperfections, just knock it down just a little bit and make it nice and smooth, okay? Okay, and then a couple of other things. I want to show you a couple of other practice pad or other like practice surfaces that you can use. First off, you can just use a tabletop if you like. It's not going to give you a lot of pull, right? And it's not going to have a lot of grain on it unless you got a rough table. But I want to show you, in particular, one practice pad that I love, 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 and then I'll show you a substitute even for a practice pad. And my college students love the second suggestion I'm going to give you. The practice pad that I like, has anybody ever seen one of these before? This is an old school, this is called a quiet tone practice pad. Now, the original quiet tone practice pad is not made any longer, except Sabian makes a version of this now. Okay, now the reason I like this in particular for brushes is because, one, coated head. Two, it's the same size, a 14-inch surface to practice on, right? And with that in mind, 13-inch drums, get them out of your vocabulary for brushes. That's like, in other words, that's too small of a surface. You practice on a 14-inch drum for a little while, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you pick up brushes and put on a 13-inch drum. But 14-inch quiet tone practice pad, and I'll let you hear what it sounds like, both with sticks and with brushes. With sticks, good for apartment dwellers, no problem. And then brushes. Okay? Now, this is what my college students love. Just a box, preferably a pizza box, right? Most of these cardboard boxes, they have a nice little feel or grain to them. Works great. Vinyl, a vinyl album jacket works good. Newspapers work great too. They're all good stuff. Now let's go to the brush sounds, okay? Let's see, let me get my clicker up. There we go. All right, so we briefly talked about the sweep or the swish. That's where you keep the brush on the drum. You can play circles, straight lines, semicircles, ovals. Anytime you're dragging that brush across the surface like that, that's a sweep or swish. The second one, the tap or the tick, just a single stroke, single individual articulated note. You can play straight up and down into the drum. I actually kind of like to play it with like a lateral stroke. It gives you a little bit more of a lush sound. Like listen to the difference. I'm just going to play some side triplets. Listen to the difference when you do sort of like that lateral motion to the drum versus when you play just directly into the drum. It's interesting, isn't it? In other words, you definitely get a little bit more of a lush, just a little bit more of a wider, bigger sound whenever you do a little bit of a slightly horizontal motion going in for your individual taps or ticks, okay? Then we go to the pop. So a pop's an accented note where the entire fan of the wire strikes the drum, and then it's completely allowed to rebound. Then you've got the slap. The slap has the same type of motion and technique as the pop, but you're going to leave the actual fan of the brush on the surface to get a drier dead sound. Then we've got the thup. The thup is a very subtle type of accent, and the thup is used primarily. You can use a thup just by itself, but the thup is primarily used inside of sweeps or swishes. And essentially what you're going to do is, and I'll demonstrate it both ways, I'm going to play some sweeps or swishes, and then to get a slight accent, what you do is you sort of press the brush down into the drum surface, and sometimes also give it just a little nudge. Give it a little nudge, and you get a little bit of a thup accent. Thup. And again, you can do it by itself. It works fine too, right? But it's primarily you find them, you'll do thups inside of sweeps or swishes. Then we've got the rim roll. And the rim roll, I think you saw me do this a little bit over here, is where you basically take the handle of the brush, which, by the way, let me say this also. Every type of brush that you can find, regardless of the wire thickness or thinness, you can find them with wood handles, plastic handles, retractable brushes, and by retractable we mean you can actually take this ring and you can pull those brushes back into the handle, which I highly, 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 highly suggest, because if you get non-retractable brushes, as soon as you put them in your stick bag, you go to the gig, you have to pull them out, and then all of a sudden it's, the wires are all bent all over the place, so I like retractable brushes a whole lot. And then the rubber handle in particular is one of the nice features of a lot of these retractable brushes, where you can play what I call a rim roll. And essentially what you do is you take the rubber handle of the brush, you place it on the rim, and then you're just going to rock the brush back and forth. And you get that sound, okay? Then you've got the nerve roll, sometimes called the trill or the tremolo, which I think you saw me do over here also, which essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take the brush, put the fan on, I like to put it on a rough part of the drum, and then you're essentially going to shake it back and forth and get kind of a tremolo or trill or sustained roll sound. For you traditional grip players, what I like to do when I'm playing traditional grip, when I do a nerve roll, I like to turn my hand over, so you can see this. And do it that way for traditional grip, okay? And then you've got the rim flex or the handle flex. And essentially what that is again, this is another one that it really works best with a rubber handled brush. What you're going to do is you're going to take the brush, you're going to hit the rim of the drum, and I like to have my hand either right at level with the rim or possibly even a little bit lower than the rim. You're going to hit the rim and then rock the brush forward using the flex of the wires, and you get sort of a flutter sound. And now one thing in particular, the really small gauge wires like the traditional 583Rs, these guys generally give you a better flutter because there's more flex. And so that's a rim flex. You can see you don't get quite as many with this one. Or maybe you do. So that's your rim flex. And then the last one, the one that all my students love, the rip. Now, this is just a straight up sound effect is pretty much what it is. And the way you perform this is with my left hand, I'm going to put the fan of the brushes on the snare. I'm going to take the tip of the fan with my right hand, and I'm going to place it again on the handle. And again, this is another place where the rubber handles work really well, okay? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to simultaneously with my left hand lift my left hand, and then I'm going to twist my right hand. I'm going to twist it inward, and you'll see what sound happens. And that's a rip, okay? All right. So any questions about anything so far? Because now what we want to do is we're going to talk about some brush patterns. In other words, how you can actually use some of this vocabulary. Is everybody good so far? All right. So what I've done is, there we go. Thank you, Greg. Okay, I've written out a few brush patterns for you. And what I've done is every good musician needs to have multiple ways to play the same style of music. So what I've done is I've essentially written out 2 ballad brush patterns, 2 medium tempo brush patterns, 2 up-tempo brush patterns, and then 2 Latin brush patterns that I'm going to play for you, okay? And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to walk over here to the drum set and play them over here, and then essentially what I'll do is I'll play the pattern, and then I'll incorporate the other drums so you can hear what it would sound like if you were playing it in an actual performance scenario, okay? All right, so we're going to start out with some ballad patterns. And this first one is called Eyes, all right? And I suppose the reason that it's called Eyes, I didn't name it that, is it looks like, once you get the circles going on, it looks like a pair of eyes or a pair of glasses. Now, essentially what you're going to do is you're going to sweep quarter note circles, all right, to create a quarter note flow. And it's going to be a very nice, round, lush, fluid kind of sounding pattern. And by the way, the reason that we're going to sweep quarter notes in particular on ballads, the quarter note is the governor of all rhythms, so to speak. And what I mean by that is it gives anyone that you're playing with, and especially a soloist that you might be playing with, free rein to play virtually any subdivision, right? Because if you overly subdivide patterns, there's a tendency for rhythms to clash, right? That's another reason why I'm a big fan of like using a quarter note click anytime you can when you're in a performance situation, because if you start using highly subdivided clicks like 8th notes, 16th notes, it's always going to be a problem when you have to play 8th note triplets or whatever with it, right? There's going to be some sort of a clash with it. So similarly, I like quarter note patterns for ballads because it will allow a soloist to freely be able to play 8th notes, quarter notes, 16th triplets, 8th triplets, you name it. Groups of 7, it should work fine right over these. So this is the Eyes brush pattern. And also, by the way, for those of you who have never seen a brush pattern, essentially, you can see that I've got the right hand that's being notated with the red arrows and the red arrows on that circle, and then I've got the left hand notated with the green arrows, okay? And so essentially what you're going to do is you're going to play sweeping quarter notes, and I like to put my quarter notes at the top of the drum. So for you old school clock people, it'd be at 12 o'clock, right? Okay? So let me show you how to play this pattern. I'm going to show you how to play it a couple different ways. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to play the Eyes pattern where the quarter notes are always going to be at the top, where the right hand will be at the top of the pattern, okay? And it would look like this. And if we put like a little 1 and 3 lightly on the bass drum and 2 and 4 on the hi-hat, now you can easily put the left hand on top. Notice that what's happening here is my left hand is sweeping counterclockwise, and my right hand sweeping clockwise. You don't have to do that. You can go the opposite direction if you like. Now, what I like to do, if you can see this now, a little fancy, what I'm basically doing is I'm alternating every quarter note. One quarter note, the right hand will be on top. Another will be the left hand. Like on count 2, the left hand will be on top. That works great for virtually any ballad, okay? All right, so let's go on to the second one. Okay, so here's this pattern. What did I call this one? Like walking ballad, okay? The reason I like this one is this one creates another really strong quarter note flow with a little bit more percussive attack. There wasn't a lot of percussive attack on that one, right? It was very lush. You might hear just like a little bit of an accent on counts, on the quarter note counts. Now on this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sweep quarter notes with my left hand, and you can see how I've got the quarter notes written up at the top where it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, roughly that's where the quarter notes are going to land. Every time I go around with counts 1, 2, 3, and 4 to be at the top of that circle. The right hand notated in red is going to play sweeps, and then when we get down to, you see where the arrow is, it's going to lift after we play the quarter note. Like we'll start with quarter note on count 1, and then it'll lift on count 2, and then count 2 will sweep down with the left hand, or excuse me, with the bottom of the drum with the right hand and create a quarter note. So for example, let me do each hand individually, okay? So the left hand's going to play quarter note circles. And then the right hand is going to play this. One, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. You put it all together. Again, another good ballad brush pattern, work with virtually anything you have to play. Just a little more percussive attack, just a little more presence on the quarter notes, okay? Now, let's go to our first medium tempo. Now, this one that I'm going to show you, this is pretty much ground zero for almost everybody when you start playing brushes. A lot of times people just call it, it's so traditional, they call it the traditional pattern. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to end up playing the jazz ride cymbal pattern with your right hand as taps on the snare drum. Okay, you're going to play taps or ticks using this pattern. And then you're going to sweep half note ovals with your left hand on the bottom part of the drum. And again, you can see I've got the left hand sweeping clockwise. You can easily sweep counterclockwise as well. Doesn't matter. The biggest thing you want to do is you just want to make sure that you keep your hands on opposite sides of the drums when you're playing. In other words, you don't want your hands to be on the same side of the drum. They're going to be chasing themselves, right, as they go back and forth. So you'll notice when you look at that pattern, count 1 for your right hand is on the right side of the drum. Count 1 for your left hand is on the left side of the drum. So essentially your hands are going to play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. So it'll look and sound like this. And notice that my right hand is traveling a little bit. It's creating what I call a pendulum motion. That's something that's, again, that's part of like what I'd call traditional jazz vocabulary. It creates a natural phrasing for your ride cymbal pattern. The faster you go with this, you have to economize your motions. They have to get a little bit smaller, right? In other words, your circles have to get a little smaller, and your taps have to get a little bit smaller. When it gets slower, you can make your motions a little bigger. And by the way, let me say this. In particular, one of the great things, or one of the things that's going to make your brush pattern sound just great, the more you can use the full surface of the drum, the bigger, fuller sound you're going to get. Okay, so for example, when you do slow down and you're doing a slower pattern, like for example, you notice when I was playing those ballad patterns, I use the entire surface of the drum. Use as much of it as you can. You're going to get a bigger, just a more lush sound. And the other thing is this, remember that us as percussionists, the type of sound that we produce is directly related to the motion that we make, right? So in other words, if you make a short, stabby motion, you're going to get a short, stabby sound, right? And that means with brushes or sticks. Even if you're playing mallets on a marimba, You make a short, stabby motion, you're going to get a short, stabby sound, right? Same, you can think about it on guitar also, right? You make a nice round fluid motion, get a nice round fluid sound. So, for example, if you're trying to get that nice round fluid brush pattern, use as much of the drum as possible. Also, creating that amount of motion, in other words, a little bit that amount of motion in between the quarter notes, that's a good thing, right? In other words, there's time in the motions, right, that you make. Like, for example, if you're playing a backbeat-oriented groove, if you're playing like a ballad, it makes sense to have a little bit of a wind-up when you play that backbeat. Right? Now, that motion in between the beats creates part of the groove in the feel. So again, that's part of that whole thing. Use the motions, right? The type of motion that you make is directly related to the sound you're going to produce, okay? So let's go on to the next pattern. Okay, now this is kind of a version of that traditional pattern, but it uses a few more sweeps. It's going to give you a little bit more of a legato sound all the way through, okay? So you'll notice that what's happening is the left hand is going to play that same type of oval, but notice that 1 and 3 is on the right side of the drum, 2 and 4 is on the left side of the drum, and that's because you're going to change the pattern you play with your right hand, okay? So now 2 and 4 is going to be on the right side of the drum, 1 and 3 is going to be on the left side of the drum, and when you sweep, when you get to counts 1 and 3, you're going to sweep a quarter note across. Like, for example, here's what, if you look up here for a second, this is what your right hand's going to do. It's going to go 1, tap on 2, then pick it up and then hit the or the skip beat of your right pattern over here on the left side of the drum, and then sweep on 3. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you put that on the drum, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now when you put your left hand in there, it creates the continuum, creates that nice lush sound underneath. Here's what you got. Put the rest of the kit with it. Okay, now, this is what you paid for, not Sonny. You came in to hear the fast stuff, right? Up-tempo patterns, okay? Now this, if any of y'all have been on my YouTube channel, I've demonstrated this pattern before, and this pattern, let me put it this way, there's no middle ground on this. This is one you either love this one or you hate it. And if you look at the comments on there's people going, there, you're cheating, man. That's a cheat. You can't play that way. So these two up-tempo patterns that I'm going to show you essentially take the jazz ride pattern and break it up between the two brushes. So in other words, your right hand is not going to play the full jazz ride pattern at a really fast tempo. You're going to break it up. And this one, I call it the Fast Philly because this is an old Philly Joe Jones brush pattern. And let me tell you, you can literally play this pattern. We could sit here all the way till 4 o'clock today, and I could talk to you while playing this pattern. It is once you get it down, it is very easy to play. It's very comfortable to play. Now, the trick on this one is simply this. You've got to make sure with your left hand, which is going to be, see, it's got the left hand has got the green sweeping arrows. You do not lift your brush until you play the taps on the right hand, on the 2 and the and the 4 and the because there's going to be a gap if you lift that brush too early. And one of the things in particular, to be able to play any type of brush pattern and make it sound good, you need a brush on the head at all times, right? Okay? So let me go ahead and play it slowly, and then I'll speed it up. Okay? So here's what it's going to sound like. And by the way, I'm going to play this. One of the things I tell all my students is this. Since this is an up-tempo pattern, okay, and it really, quite honestly, it only sounds good at up-tempos, phrase this thing even when you're working on it in straight eighths. There's no need to go ja, da, 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 da. Phrase it ba, 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 because we know that when we play up-tempo ride patterns, it's not triplets, right? In other words, when you play at medium tempos, of course it's triplets. But when you get to an up-tempo pattern, it flattens out. and it turns into straight eighths or sixteenths, however you want to think of it, right? That's what happens. So that's what's going to happen with this also. Slowly, then I'll speed it up. We can sit here and talk about how the Atlanta Braves are going to win the World Series this year. Right? I mean, it's effortless. Effortless, okay? And then again, some people don't like that. Like I said, go check out my YouTube channel, and you'll see some very nasty comments on that, okay? So, next one. Okay, now this is notice that I used a little bit of vocabulary when I named this one, called a double time thup. So this is another one that basically takes the jazz ride pattern and breaks it up between two hands. Now you'll notice that if you look at the right hand where the taps are, they're not on the 2 in the and the 4 in the and. They're on count 1 and then the skip beat, the 2 and the 4 and then your left hand is going to accent thups on counts 2 and 4. So let me play it again, play this one, start this one out slowly, and then I'll speed it up. And again, this is another one. This one feels really good whenever you start playing it. You can sit here and, you know, you can play for 30 minutes on this and never get tired, okay? One, one, one. Okay, so that's another good double time pattern, all right? Now, it's always good to have some Latin stuff in your back pocket, right? You never know when you're going to need that, okay? Now, this first one that I'm going to show you, this is one I just flat out made this one up, and it was one of those things, you know, you've heard the old saying that, what is it, necessity is the mother of invention? Yeah. I used to play with a bossa nova guitarist, singer, vocalist, and he had one of the lightest voices. And I mean, it's a very light music anyway. And just think in terms of like an acoustic singer-songwriter playing, you know, nylon string style guitar, and he had a very light voice. And he sang in Portuguese also. And almost anything you would play would be too loud, right? Even if he was mic'd up. And so essentially I came up with this little brush pattern where essentially I'm taking that, you can see I've got written in notation up above it what we call the bossa nova clave, the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to play quarter note sweeps with both hands. I'm going to play the left hand playing clockwise, right hand counterclockwise. And what I'm going to do is with my right hand, you can see that I'm going to accent the quarter note downbeats. I'm going to accent 1 and then count 4 in the first measure and then count 2 in the second measure. And then my left hand is going to accent any of the upbeats, which would be the and of 2 in the first measure and the and of 3 in the second measure. So let me play it first just on the snare drum, and then I'll incorporate the rest of it in so you can hear how it sounds with like a bossa nova bass drum, okay? So again, what you're going to do is you're going to end up playing sweeps, and then I'll play some thups that are going to outline that da, 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 da. Now, here's the thing. Once you get into this, once you start establishing this bossa nova, you're going to improvise that. A lot of people think, well, when you play a bossa nova, that's the bossa nova beat, right? Well, that's kind of just like somebody coming in and playing this and saying, that's the rock beat. Well, that's one of about 10,000 rock beats, right? And it's the same thing. This is just kind of the jump-off point of a bossa nova. Bossa novas, once you get into them, they're completely and totally improvised. So, again, if we start playing, and I'll improvise around this a little bit. okay? So very subtle, all right? And then the last one I want to show you. Okay, this is a little kind of, I'm going to call it like a half brush pattern, where the right hand is going to be playing sweeping eighth notes, and you can also sweep 16th notes. I'll demonstrate this. But your left hand is going to use a cross stick to play that actual clave pattern, okay? So if I was just going to play a traditional bossa nova very lightly, just super traditional, it would sound something like this. Right? This is without any improvisation. If you want to lighten it up, not have any hi-hat, what I'm doing is I'm just sweeping eighth notes, right, with my right hand. And so I'm going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now you can just as easily, if you want to do the old brush like a stick, you can just do that too, right? You can tap some eighth notes. So that's just some taps, and then here's your sweeps. You can double time it. Okay, so just some options there. All right? Any questions? Got just a couple more things, and we're going to bring somebody out that I'm going to introduce you to. Yes? Oh, yeah. Guiro pattern. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that's a great pattern. Yeah, in other words, does everybody know what a guiro is? That's it's basically it's a gourd that has some notches that are cut in it, and you can. Oh, wait a minute, hang on just a second, Brian. I get to show you guys an artifact of old drumming history. Check this out. See if you guys have ever seen this before. Look at this. There was a friend of mine, a guy named Johnny Rabb, that had a short-lived drumstick company for a while, and he made these sticks that had this set of notches that he would use, especially like on the rims of drums. But I always used it like a guiro, and that's the pattern that he was talking about that you would play with the brush. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah. Okay, now just a few last things. Now I've showed you what the sounds are, and I've showed you some of the patterns. Well, now how do you practice the technique? So I don't want you guys leaving here without knowing some different things to practice and just some general overall tips. Okay, I think we've already mentioned one thing that's going to be really important, and that is, if possible, especially when you're playing patterns, always keep a brush on the head at all times, okay? Keep a brush on the head for continuity of sound. When it comes to technique, another thing that I like to tell everybody is when you're playing, make sure that you're not only using, of course, like shoulders, elbows, and wrists. Use your fingers also to help guide the brush around, right? In other words, where you're playing match grip, which I think I've primarily played traditional grip today with these, but if you're playing match grip or traditional grip, also use your fingers to help guide the brush. Jeff Hamilton would even tell you, he would say, act like you have a fish by the tail, right? In other words, use your wrist and use your fingers to help guide that brush around the drum. Now, one thing that I will tell you, I've seen some guys, and I've seen some like really super strong educators do this thing where they extend their finger out. Now, I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a big fan of extending your finger to help guide the brush around. To me, that actually kind of hinders things a little bit. I just use just a regular match style grip in this hand, right? And allow my fingers to guide the brush around, okay? Let's see. Did you notice that everything I've done today has been with the snares off? I love playing brushes with the snares off for a couple of reasons. One, if you have the snares on, there's a tendency to mask any imperfections, right? Like, for example, I tell most of my students also that when you practice, in particular, like rudiments, even with sticks on a snare drum, practice with the snares off. In other words, you'll really be able to hear if you have any imperfections in there then at that time, right? So I like playing brushes with the snares off for that. And the other reason is this. Sometimes the snare wires have a tendency to mask a little bit of the sound of the brushes because they're close to the same frequency, right? They're both kind of high-pitched. So if you leave the snares off, you get to really hear the sound of the brushes, okay? Now, you notice that there were a few things that I was doing, like when I was demonstrating some of the brush patterns. Like, for example, I would turn my back to you, and I would show you, like, the pattern like this. Usually, this is that eyes pattern that I was playing, where I was alternating my hands at the top of the quarter notes, where it has that little bit of a fancy look. Let me tell you, you can practice a lot of brush patterns without any brushes in your hands. In other words, get the fluidity of your motions down, get the choreography, sort of the ballet of your hands down when you're doing this. Like, for example, you could do also just the traditional pattern, da, 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 right? In other words, just use your fingers and hands to trace the outline. I've seen some of you all actually doing that today when we were looking at the patterns that will help you kind of trace the outline of what these patterns should sound like and what your technique should feel like when you play them. You don't even have to have the brushes in your hands, okay? And then one other thing that I see all the time, okay, in particular when you're playing tapped rhythms, and let's take that jazz ride pattern for a second, this thing. Almost everybody, when they start out playing, have a tendency to over-control the brush. In other words, they're all about like, okay, well, it's not a stick, so I got to make sure I pull that brush out of the head. You don't necessarily have to do that. There is some rebound on brushes, even the thinnest brush with the most flex. So what I tell all my students is make sure you throw that brush to the surface and let it bounce, accept the rebound. It's going to give you a way more natural sound as well, okay? You don't want to over-control your brush. You just have to experiment a little bit with it. It's not going to give you, of course, the same rebound as a stick, but there is rebound here for sure. You wouldn't be able to play this fast of a single-handed pattern if there wasn't some rebound in it. You're not going to be able to pull that note out at that tempo, okay? And then, last couple things, all right? Some things you can just practice. For example, we talked about rudiments, right? In other words, everybody thinks in terms of rudiments, it's a stick-based thing, right? I'm practicing my 5-stroke roll with sticks. Well, you can also do the exact same thing with brushes. I'm going to show you 2 different ways you can do this, okay? Now, of course, we've talked about how you can play brushes like sticks and how you can play brushes like brushes. Well, of course, with a 5-stroke roll, you can play them like sticks. Nothing wrong with that, right? But you can also, where the accent is on the 5th stroke on the single, play a sweep. Also, I played that in the binary rhythm. You can also play it in the ternary rhythm, the triplet rhythm. Everybody knows you can play it. You can do the sweeps with that too. Take the 7-stroke roll, do it in binary. Do it in ternary. Thirteen-stroke roll, binary. Ternary. I also like, let me tell you, the drag rudiments are fantastic also, because if you notice, if you look at the list of drag rudiments, have you ever noticed that when you look at drag rudiments, the accents are never on the drags, it's always somewhere else? The only exception to that is like the single drag-a-diddle. And then you compare it to the flams, when you look at the flam rudiments, all of the flams, the accents are on the flams except for the flamacue. So when you're doing a drag rudiment, and I'll show you a couple of those, where the accent lands, like for example, let's take a ratamacue, okay? The accent's on the last note of the ratamacue, right? Ra-pa-pa-pop, right? So you can do it again, of course, brushes like sticks. Then do the accent with the sweep. Double drag tap, this one feels good because it's triplety. So you can, of course, again, then sweep. do a whole bunch of different rudiments that way. And it kind of works a whole bunch of different muscles whenever you do it. And then last thing, okay? One of my favorite books, and you'll hear Sonny talk about this also, one of my favorite books in the world, or I would just say series of books, how about this? Is everybody familiar with the great educator and author Charles Wilcoxon? Well, he wrote several books, but there are two in particular that are must-haves, that every single person in here, if you don't have this book today, get out your phone and order it, okay? The two books in particular are the 150 rudimental solos for the All-American drummer. There's one of my students pulling one out right now. And then the other one is the one that I'm going to show you here in just a second. Let me see. Oh, that one. That one right there, Modern Rudimental Swing Solos for the Advanced Drummer. And I took this one solo. This is a solo that I think a lot of you might already be familiar with. It's called Rolling in Rhythm. And, you know, we always think in terms of playing that, of course, with sticks. Of course, it sounds great. But one of the things that I like to do is I like to play it with brushes, okay? Now, again, let me demonstrate this thing. I won't play the whole thing, but I'm going to demonstrate just a couple pieces or portions of it, all right? So if you can see up here, okay, I'm going to play just the first couple lines. I'm just going to play it with brushes like I'm playing it with sticks, okay? Okay, so I made it about halfway through. Now, what I like to do, though, is I like to actually take the accents and play them as sweeps, okay? So I'm going to play all the unaccented notes as taps and the accents as sweeps. And then there's a few flams in there, I'm just going to play the flams like flams. I'm not going to sweep on those, okay? So, and then the other thing you'll notice about this actually sounds maybe just a little bit better if you slow it down a little bit, simply from the standpoint that you can actually hear the sweeps a little bit better. So let me demonstrate this. Okay? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I hope